Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam into a world still trembling with the aftershocks of the Reformation and the Renaissance, and yet already beginning to pulse with the new rhythms of science and reason. His family were Portuguese Jews, refugees from the Iberian Peninsula, where the shadow of the Inquisition fell heavily on anyone who dared to hold a belief outside the rigid bounds of Catholic orthodoxy. They fled to the Netherlands, a land more tolerant, where ideas could breathe more freely and commerce tied together people of different faiths. But even in this relatively open society, Spinoza would soon learn how dangerous it was to think differently, to question inherited dogmas, and to search for truth not in scriptures or traditions, but in the unyielding clarity of reason itself. As a child, Spinoza was trained in Jewish learning, immersed in scripture, law, and commentary. Yet his restless mind could not be confined within the walls of tradition. He read the works of Descartes and other modern thinkers, and he found in them a vision of truth that seemed more solid than the shifting interpretations of rabbis or priests. Descartes had taught that knowledge could be built upon reason as firmly as geometry, but Spinoza would go further, applying that same geometric method to the deepest questions of life, morality, and the divine itself. In doing so, he would scandalize religious authorities, endure excommunication, and live much of his life in obscurity, grinding lenses for a modest living. But his quiet pen produced ideas that would echo through the centuries, shaping philosophy, science, and even politics long after his death. Spinoza's philosophy begins with a question that humans have asked since the dawn of consciousness: what is God? For most of his time, God was understood as a personal being, a ruler beyond the world, a creator who intervenes, judges, rewards, and punishes. But Spinoza could not accept such a vision. To him, the idea of a personal deity with human-like passions was a projection, a reflection of our own fears and desires onto the universe. If God was truly infinite, eternal, and absolute, how could he be limited by emotions, or confined to the heavens like a monarch ruling from a distant throne? For Spinoza, God was not outside the world at all. God was the world. God was nature itself, the infinite substance that exists in and through itself, the ground of all being. This was his radical claim: Deus sive Natura, God or nature. To say God and to say nature was, in truth, to say the same thing. This idea was not only shocking but dangerous. It undermined the traditional authority of churches and synagogues. If God was not a king to be obeyed but the very fabric of existence, then prayers, rituals, and dogmas lost their privileged place. Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish community at the age of 23, cast out with curses that forbade any member from speaking to him. Yet he did not waver. He lived simply, avoided the spotlight, and devoted himself to philosophy, seeking truth not in conformity but in clarity. Spinoza's concept of substance is central to his system. He argued that there can only be one substance, infinite and self-caused, and that everything else, every star, every rock, every human, is merely a mode, a modification of that one infinite substance. In other words, all the diversity of the universe is but expressions of the same underlying reality. Just as waves rise and fall on the surface of the ocean, so too do individual beings arise and pass within the infinite sea of nature. We are not separate from God, we are expressions of God, finite glimpses of the infinite. This was pantheism at its purest form, and it offered a vision of unity that dissolved the boundary between sacred and secular, divine and worldly. But if God is nature, what does this mean for human freedom? At first glance, it seems to crush it. For Spinoza argued that everything follows from the necessity of the divine nature, just as the properties of a triangle follow from its definition. There is no randomness, no miracles, no events outside the chain of cause and effect. Everything is determined. Even our thoughts, desires, and actions flow from causes that precede them. We feel free, but that is only because we are ignorant of the causes that determine us. This idea scandalized many, for it seemed to deny free will, responsibility, and morality itself. Yet Spinoza offered a subtler vision of freedom, one that still speaks powerfully today. True freedom, he argued, is not the absence of necessity but the understanding of necessity. When we are driven by passions, by anger, fear, or blind desire, we are slaves to forces we do not understand. But when we come to see why we feel as we do, when we understand the causes that shape us, we can begin to act from reason rather than impulse. Freedom is not to break the laws of nature but to live in harmony with them, guided by the clear light of understanding. In this way, the study of philosophy becomes the path to liberation, freeing us from superstition and confusion, allowing us to align ourselves with the infinite order of existence. Spinoza's Ethics, his masterpiece, is written not as a sermon or a dialogue but as a series of definitions, axioms, propositions, and proofs, in the style of geometry. To many, this seemed cold and abstract, but Spinoza believed that only such a method could reveal truth with certainty. Beneath its austere surface, however, pulses a vision of life filled with profound human warmth. He speaks of the power of love, not the narrow love of a jealous God, but the intellectual love of God, that is, the joyful recognition that we ourselves are part of the infinite, that our minds participate in the eternal order of nature. This intellectual love, he claimed, brings the highest happiness, a kind of blessedness that cannot be shaken by fortune or death. Morality, for Spinoza, is not obedience to commandments handed down from above, but the flourishing of our own nature in accordance with reason. Virtue is power, not in the sense of domination, but in the sense of living fully, expressing our essence as rational beings. The good life is one where we understand ourselves, our emotions, and our place in nature, and where we cultivate joy, cooperation, and peace with others. For though each of us is finite, our well-being is tied to the well-being of others, since we are all expressions of the same infinite substance. In this sense, Spinoza's philosophy anticipates modern humanism, offering a morality without superstition, grounded in reason and in the interconnectedness of all life. His political writings, too, were ahead of their time. In his theological political treatise, he defended freedom of thought and speech, arguing that the state should not impose religious dogma. He believed that democracy was the form of government most in harmony with human nature, for it allowed individuals to live freely under laws they themselves had a part in shaping. At a time when Europe was still torn by religious wars and authoritarian rule, these ideas were revolutionary, and they influenced later thinkers of the Enlightenment, laying the groundwork for modern liberal democracy. Yet Spinoza was no dreamer of utopias. He knew well the power of passions, the ease with which fear and superstition could be manipulated by rulers and priests. He himself lived under the threat of persecution, his works often published anonymously or posthumously to avoid scandal. When he died in 1677 at the age of 44, likely from lung illness caused by fine glass dust from his lens grinding, he was still a relatively obscure figure. But his writings began to spread, and over time, his vision of God, nature, and human freedom found champions among poets, scientists, and philosophers. Goethe called him the man most full of love. Einstein said he believed in Spinoza's God, a God of harmony, not miracles. Modern psychology, neuroscience, and ecology all echo with Spinoza's insights into the interconnectedness of mind, body, and environment. To read Spinoza is to be challenged, for he strips away the comforting illusions of a world ruled by a personal deity, or a will free from all causes. But he replaces them with a vision that is no less profound, a world in which everything belongs, everything follows from the infinite necessity of nature, and our greatest happiness lies in understanding this and living in harmony with it. In an age still haunted by divisions between faith and science, body and soul, nature and spirit, Spinoza's philosophy offers a way to see them not as opposites but as expressions of the same infinite reality. His message endures because it speaks to the deepest human longings, to understand our place in the cosmos, to find freedom amid necessity, to live joyfully in harmony with ourselves, others, and the world. Spinoza teaches that we do not need to fear God, for God is not a tyrant but the infinite life of which we are part. We do not need to cling to dogma, for reason can guide us to a deeper peace. And we do not need to despair at our finitude, for in understanding the eternal, we participate in it. Though exiled in his time, Spinoza has become a companion for all who seek wisdom beyond superstition, clarity beyond confusion, and love beyond fear. Even now, centuries later, his words continue to inspire those who feel the weight of modern anxieties. In a world fractured by ideology, consumed by materialism, and haunted by environmental crises, his reminder that we are not separate from nature but one with it resonates with new urgency. To love God, for Spinoza, is to love the world, to care for its order, to cherish its beauty, and to live responsibly within it. To know ourselves is not to discover an isolated soul, but to recognize that we are waves on the infinite ocean, fleeting yet part of eternity. Spinoza lived quietly, died young, and left behind only a small circle of friends who understood the magnitude of his thought. But the seeds he planted grew into some of the most important developments in modern philosophy. His skepticism toward dogma, his confidence in reason, his vision of the divine as immanent in nature, all of these shaped the path of the Enlightenment and beyond. And while his style may be demanding, his vision remains liberating, reminding us that the universe itself is divine, that knowledge is freedom, and that joy comes not from submission to authority but from understanding and embracing the infinite. When we speak of Spinoza, we speak of a man who dared to see God not as a distant ruler but as the very life of existence, who saw human freedom not as a gift from above but as the fruit of understanding, who saw morality not as obedience but as flourishing. To engage with his thought is to encounter a philosophy that is at once rigorous and compassionate, abstract and deeply human. It is to be reminded that in the midst of necessity, we can find joy, in the midst of finitude, we can touch eternity. Baruch Spinoza, once exiled, now stands as one of the greatest guides to truth, showing us how to see God, nature, and the infinite as one.